Hello, I'm Tom Lyon, and this is Asking Children About Time and Number. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, all the research I do as a law professor is based on my experience as a county attorney working for Children's Services in Los Angeles County, realizing how little training one received in interviewing children, and then when I started looking around, realized how little training there was even available. This was in the 1980s. I went back to school in developmental psychology and got my PhD in experimental psychology, and ever since then I've been working to develop techniques for improving the interviewing of children, with the idea being that we should, the obvious idea actually, that we should maximize productivity at the same time that we minimize suggestibility and minimize influence and of course minimize error. So one of the most difficult problems is in the area of asking children questions about time and number. And the reasons for this is because time and number are abstract concepts. We have lots of weird ways of talking about them that children don't naturally acquire at a young age. They have to be explicitly taught. A lot of these concepts are things that children don't learn about until they're 8 to 10 years of age, and even once they learn about them, they're not able to put this knowledge into use until they've developed some really good, what we call inferential skills at making inferences, which is something that's difficult even for many adults to do. So let me give you an overview, and I should mention that that I'm following a PowerPoint presentation, but of course you're just looking at me, so you're not getting the full benefit of this unless you have the PowerPoint slides in front of you. And so I highly recommend that that you print out the PowerPoint slides. You received a PDF, or at least if you can't look at them right now, I recommend that you look at them later, because you'll see that this gives in a very nice outline form the talk that I'm giving to you now. So here's my overview. This is basically what I'm going to say in the next 45 minutes or so. First of all, the basic point is going to be that you want to avoid time and number questions as much as possible. The exception to this is certain very open-ended questions, questions that are non-leading, that allow children to respond with their own words, that allow children to respond with at their own level of conceptual development. And what kinds of open-ended questions? What happened next questions turn out to be very effective, partly because they're so open-ended, partly because notice that although they are asking a child about something that we think of as time, it's the simplest idea of time, and that is the notion of sequence within an event. Sequence within an event is something that even very, very young children are able to talk about. And also another open-ended question that has to do with time is when questions. Now this may come to you as a surprise if you've got some prior knowledge about children's difficulty with talking about time. The reason why when questions are good, despite children's difficulties, is that the when question does not insist that the child respond with a particular kind of time or temporal information. Rather, when allows the child to respond in light of the child's own understanding of time. So a lot of times when you ask a when question, a very young child will tell you what happened just before, because the child is very good at talking about things that happen in a sequence. An older child who knows more about conventional ideas about time, and we'll talk more about what that is, will be able to give you more information about, say, what time of the year it was, or they might even be able to give you some sort of calendar estimate. But the idea is that when you ask a when question, you're allowing the child to tell you when in terms of what the child knows about when. But except for what happened next questions and when questions, I'm going to say you should, as much as possible, avoid questions about time and number. The reason for this, and I explained this at the very beginning, and I can't say this too many times, I don't think, is because children are likely to find questions about time and number extremely difficult, and they're likely to guess which is extremely dangerous because, of course, if they guess, there's a good chance they're incorrect. If they guess, there's a good chance they're going to be inconsistent. And of course, if a child guesses and the child doesn't show that they have a lot amount of uncertainty, and then the child is later shown to be either inconsistent or actually wrong, this is a horrible means by which the child's entire story, entire narrative can be undermined and thought to be incredible. Because the idea is that, well, if the child's willing to guess about this serious information, then how do we know if the rest of what the child is saying is true? So, to avoid overtaxing children's limited conceptual, cognitive understanding of time and number, we should simply avoid these questions whenever we can. Now, the reason why these time and number questions are so difficult is twofold. And again, I referenced this briefly just a moment ago, but I want to reinforce this. The first reason is because any questions about time and number that go beyond those what happened next questions and those when questions require children to have some understanding of what we call conventional temporal knowledge or conventional time concepts. And what does conventional mean? Well, conventional means that it's not something that people innately understand. It's something that people have to learn, and they have to learn in light of the culture that they live in. And so kids don't naturally think, there are 30 days or so in a month. Kids don't naturally think, there are 12 months in a year. They don't naturally think that that we age people by whether or not they've passed their birthday, and that every time they pass their birthday, they add a number to their age. These are all what we call conventional concepts, and these are things that have to be learned, that have to be, for the most part, explicitly taught to children. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these things are not learned until children are quite old, if at all. I still have trouble, for example, with there's that rhyme about, 30 days, 31 days, and I always have to look that up. So there are a lot of temporal concepts that are still not understood, even if a child is quite old. The second reason why time and number questions are so difficult is because it's not enough to have that conventional temporal knowledge. And this is where people make huge mistakes, where they think if they ask a child to say the months of the year or the seasons, or to tell us their birth date, or to tell us how old they are, that then is sufficient for the child to answer questions about when something may have happened to them. But that's not sufficient, right? It's necessary, but not sufficient. And it's not sufficient because you have to add to that conventional knowledge an ability to make inferences. And what do I mean by an inference? An inference is when you don't just directly remember some fact, but you have to figure out what the answer must be, right? And you do that, of course, through some sort of inferential work. So if you ask me, what month was it that you last? What would be the question you might ask me? What was the month when I last went camping with one of my kids? And that really takes me back a long ways. I would say, well, it must have been December, because I remember we went to Big Bear. And you go to Big Bear, I remember it was snowing when we went to Big Bear, so it must have been around then. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't January or February, because I vaguely remember that we went during the Christmas vacation. Now notice that all the inferential work I'm doing, so it isn't just that I know the months of the year, it's that I know that December is linked to the winter, is linked to vacation, before Christmas, all sorts of knowledge that I have. And that knowledge is being used inferentially to process what I do directly remember, which is the experience of having, gone out on sleds with my son when he was a little boy for a camping trip. Okay? So hopefully I've convinced you, just from thinking about what a difficult problem this is, that it's probably not a good idea to ask a child questions about, well, what month do you think it was, or what season was it, or how old do you think you were? Nevertheless, if I look at your interviews, I'll see you asking lots of these questions. And part of this is because we feel we have to know this information for legal reasons, and there is some truth in that. And part of it is we think, well, if I help the child out, I can get them to thinking about these things in a sensible way, and they can give me a sensible answer. So let's think about that more. Can children give us sensible information if we ask them to come up with dates? And what I'm going to do is talk to you about a study that I did with several collaborators. And what we were interested in is, can children give us this kind of information? Because if you look at forensic interviews, you'll see that children oftentimes will say, I was 4 years old when it happened, or I was 7 years old, or it was before Christmas. And of course, they're saying these things not spontaneously. Children rarely just come out with this stuff. Rather, what they're doing is being responsive to interviewers' urgings to give this kind of information. And some people will look at that and say, well, that shows that children can do this. But of course, it doesn't show they can do it accurately. It just shows that they're willing to try to produce this kind of information. So we thought, well, what would be a good way to really test if children can do this? If we go to a group of abused kids and ask when they were abused, we will get information from them about, say, their age. But because we can't corroborate it, right, because we can't say for sure when the abuse occurred, that's not a very sensible way of looking at this. So what we did is we did start with maltreated children. These are the children that are of interest to us. But we asked them questions about things that we knew we could date. And we thought about things that we thought would be the closest things we could get to in terms of abuse. They would be serious, they would be memorable, they would be, in most cases, repeated. And so what we looked at is their memory for placement changes, which of course could be a very serious and traumatic event for a child, and court visits, which isn't such a big deal, but still is a pretty significant event. And we took 167 60-year-old children, 6 to 10-year-old children, and all of these children are children that have been removed from their parents because of maltreatment. Half of them we asked about their prior placements, so places that they had to live after they couldn't live with their parents anymore. And half of them we asked about court placements. We talked to them about the court building, and we said, this is where you come to court, and I want to ask you about other times that you've come to court. We asked them information about current time. So how old are you now? When's your birthday? What month is it? Part of this was we wanted to know, can kids even do this? But also partly we thought, will this understanding then correlate? Will this predict whether they can make some sensible statements about these prior events? And again, this would be kind of like what someone might think they should do as a pre-test. And then we asked them how old they were, what month it was, the first time that they had to go live with someone else, the last time that they had to go live with someone else, or the first time that they had come to court, or the last time that they had come to court. And finally, we asked them a couple of number questions, depending on whether they were the placement children who were being asked about placements, or the court children who were being asked about going to court. We simply said, how many times? Right? So how many different places have you lived? How many times have you been to court? Okay. Now, you can't see this graph unless you look at your PowerPoint, which you may not have, so I'll just tell you. What we found is that children are very good at telling you how old they are. That's something that even the 6-year-olds were pretty much at ceiling on, meaning they were 100% accurate on. They are also quite good at telling you the month of their birthday, although even here we had a little difficulty with a fair number of our 6-year-olds, so that they were only about 65% correct, right? So even that very fundamental knowledge that I think it's probably the case that in most non-maltreated samples, kids who are more privileged backgrounds, there's more attention paid to their birthdays. You'll get rates near 100% by 4, but here among our 6-year-olds, about 35% didn't know what month they were born. And when we asked them about their current month, here we didn't see really good performance until around 9. At that point, you got about 90% of children knowing what the month was. But you saw error rates approaching 30% for the 8 and 7-year-olds, and the 6-year-olds, most of them had no idea what month it was. Only about 30%, less than 1 in 3 kids could tell you what the current month was. Now, of course, that is kind of like puts a lower bound on the expectations for the child to be able to tell us about when some prior event occurred, right? Because if they don't know what month it is now, how would they possibly begin to think about what month some prior event was? Okay. Now if I can get my slide to advance. Excuse me a second. There we go. So the next slide is time of placement. So what this slide talks about is how well did they do when they were asked how old they were when they first had to live with someone else, and how old were they the last time that they had to change where they lived. And what we found is among the children who were asked about their first placement, and that was an average of about 2 years ago, less than 50% were correct. Only 42% of children could tell us. And think about what this means. This is 6 to 10-year-olds who are being asked about something that for the average child was just a couple years ago. And we said, how old were you when you first had to leave and live with someone other than your parents? And you get less than half of kids getting this right. So if you're an 8-year-old, you're being asked about something that happened when you were 6. And it's obviously something significant, but more likely than not, you're not going to know. And children were at chance in estimating the month. So they're just guessing. What about the last placement? Well, the last placement usually had changed about 1.5 years ago for the average child, and only slightly better than half. So only about 54% got it right, and month again was basically at chance. Okay, what about court placements? Court placements occur more recently, and let's see. And what we found with court visits was unfortunately not much better. So most kids, it had been less than 2 years since their first court visit, but only 52% were correct, and they were guessing at what month it was. And finally, their age at the last court visit, and this was the most recent event that we queried. It was 6 months ago for the average child, and the percentage correct only got up to just under 60%. So you still have about half of children not being able to tell you how old they were when asked about a pretty significant event that for most children occurred 6 months previously. And here we did find above chance performance among the older children, but you got to stop and think, well, what do you mean by above chance? Do you mean they were good at it? And the answer is no, they were still pretty lousy at it. They were only about 20% correct. But notice that if you're guessing what month something is, then you're only going to be correct 1 out of 12 times, right? Because there are 12 guesses that you can make, and if you're totally random, then you should get it right about 1 out of 12 times. Well, that's only about 8%, 9%. These kids were only 20%, so they were doing better than total guessing, but they were still pretty lousy. Okay. Now, these numbers are always a bit dry, so I want to give you some conclusions and tell you about how well kids did in their number of placements. And I'm going to show you a clip where you'll get to see the distinction between children's ability to remember these significant events in their lives and their difficulty in telling you about the time. Okay, before I get to that clip, let me give you some quick conclusions on children's understanding of time. First, children's knowledge of current time, and that includes age, their birthday, the month, doesn't predict an ability to estimate when something occurred. So the way we tested this exactly was we looked at those children who were better or worse on answering those initial questions. How old are you now? What month is it? What month were you born? And we looked to see if that predicted whether they could answer the questions. And it was a very weak predictor. So basically, you can't use those as questions that will then say, oh, okay, I know this kid can tell me how old he was because he can tell me how old he is now. The second prediction is that children are unlikely to remember how old they were when they experience significant events. Now, there's some contradictory evidence here. So there are some studies of non-maltreated kids, and those tend to be kids who are, at least middle class. They tend to be obviously in intact homes, and I think most significantly, they're asked about things that are nominated by their parents, about significant events that only occurred on a single time. They explicitly avoided the idea of this repetitive event, and they found that kids were actually pretty good at dating things. And these were events approximately the same age as our kids, and events that were probably 2 to 3 years ago. They found that kids were actually quite good at it. But what I find significant in looking at that research is I think that would mislead you about a child's ability to date abuse. In fact, I think abuse is going to be even more difficult to date because of the secrecy and the lack of systematic regularity with which abuse occurs, right? Abuse is a kind of crazy, sporadic thing. It's not something that the family talks about. It's not something that, like the child, they show home movies and they say, oh yeah, remember when your uncle touched you? That kind of stuff that allows children to build up memories that they can then date because they're told at some point, in many cases, how old they were when these things happened. That's not going to exist for abuse. And even our placement removal and our court visits are things that are, I think likely to be talked about more in a way that would allow the child to capture the temporal information than abuse. Okay, so that's my temporal conclusion. What about the number of times? What did we find? Because you'll notice that this study is awesome for also asking children, well, how many places have you lived and how many times have you been to court? So first of all, the average child had been in 3 different placements, and we found that they were only 23% correct. So notice that this is much worse than their ability to say how old they were the first time that they had been removed, even though the average is a very small number. When we ask them, well, have you lived in one place or more than one place, here we do find that most children can give us a sensible answer. About 2 out of 3 kids, about 67%. Although notice it's still not at what we call at ceiling. It's still not close to 100%. And we didn't see any improvement in age. So it wasn't the case that the older kids were better at this. Number of court visits. The average child had been to court 3 times, so very similar to placements. Here they were only 14% correct, and I think this would make sense. That would be less memorable, less separable in the child's mind. Once or more than once, about 62% correct, so they're doing, I think that's better. Well, actually, it's hard to figure out what chance would be, but it certainly seems okay performance, not quite as good as the number of placements, but again, no age improvement. I mean, the bottom line is a lot of kids are just not going to be able to answer these numerosity questions. Okay, let me give you an example. Like I said, these numbers get kind of dry, and I want you to see for yourself the contrast between a child who would be one of the younger children in our study, a 6-year-old child who's describing abuse, as opposed to the child trying to produce this kind of time information. Okay. And this is a study, this is a case study involving a 6-year-old girl who was abused by her uncle. And on this particular occasion, when she was abused, the mother comes down early in the morning. The uncle is visiting the family. She discovers him in the kitchen with the little girl, and the little girl's pants are down, and the uncle is wiping her genitalia with a towel, right? So that's, of course, extremely damning evidence, and of course think about what information can the mother subsequently provide to the investigators in terms of answering the kinds of questions we need to answer. But then of course Leslie, this child, needs to be asked, well, what happened? And I want to play you a tape which will give you a sense of how capable she is of answering what happened. But then you'll see the interviewer slip without anyone's permission. This was the interviewer off on her own, trying to get additional information that she thought the child might provide. And you'll see what happens to Leslie's credibility and apparent competency when she's asked questions about time.
What did he do with his thing?
Everything. He would step on me, then push me.
He just pushed it on you?
Yeah, right there.
Okay.
Same thing.
Did his thing just touch you, or did
His thing is touching me right here. Pushing me back, until I hit the thing. I want he's hold on the table. Do not drop the thing where I won't get mad. So I hold on the table, not for that reason, to push him and run away from him. That's what I wanted to do.
That's what you wanted to do?
But he just hold my knees, and I wanted to scream, but he held me more. And I wanted to push him, but the thing that is, he held with his knees. His hands like that. And he had like 2 arms like that. Like that. And tucking this way, I cannot scream or touch my knee. He was like, I had a dress on, and I was doing like that. I wanted to push him. I was holding on the table. He wanted to push me, but he is holding my legs not, so I cannot scream or push me.
So he had his hand on your legs?
Only I had my head to drop the things from the back. But the thing that is, told me already about it, and I wanted to do it because if I broke the radio, my mom would get mad.
So he told you not to push over the stuff because your mom would get mad if you broke the radio?
Okay, now I'm going to pause it just to make a comment. So a lot of details that this little girl is producing. Now, you might have seen her doing something with dolls, and actually we didn't systematically question children with dolls. And one thing you might have noticed is that she didn't seem to need the dolls to describe, because she described with her own body the positioning. She gives some very graphic details about him putting his hand over her mouth, so she could not scream, even though she wanted to, pushing. It's really, I think, quite convincing to anybody that this child has been assaulted by this man. A really interesting sort of childish perspective she has on it is that she didn't want to knock over things because her mother would get mad at her, and that's like the child who thinks, oh my gosh, I'm going to get in trouble for knocking over stuff, when, oh my God, any adult would say, but you're being sexually assaulted by this man. Why would you even think about worrying about knocking over things? Pretty convincing, I think. Well, what happens if the interviewer starts asking the child questions about time?
Do you remember when it was?
Now, notice she shakes her head no. Okay, and unfortunately, a really typical a pattern that one will see in interviews is the interviewer will ask the child if they know the answer to a question. The child will say no, and then the interviewer will say, okay, well, I'm going to break it down for you. I'm going to give you these very closed-ended questions in order to try to help you. But as you'll remember, a closed-ended question, a forced choice question, is a question that's going to lead the child to attempt to answer the question. And so even if they have no idea, they're going to give you an answer.
Was it a day ago or a lot?
A day ago.
It was 1 day ago that this happened? Okay.
Well, that's not good. It's been several weeks since it happened. So if one is taking seriously the idea that the child should be able to answer these questions, she's already undermined her credibility.
What time in the day was it?
I think it's 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. So it was in the
afternoon.
Okay, so notice that she's giving this, she seems to be understanding these questions, right? So she says it's 6 o'clock. She can say it's in the afternoon. Of course, the irony here is that that's one in the That's the only time 6 o'clock can't be, right? 6 o'clock can be in the morning, most of us would say, or 6 o'clock would be in the evening. But the way to think about it is the 6-year-old has these words in her head, and she has a sort of a vague notion of what these words mean, but she doesn't have a fully integrated understanding of all these temporal concepts.
Afternoon. Where was your dad?
At work.
Oh, okay.
He comes at 4.
He comes home at 4? He hadn't come home from work yet?
I think he comes at, I mean he comes at 9
Oh.
at night.
He gets home late? Is it dark outside when your dad comes home?
I don't know, he doesn't tell me.
Okay, so here, I mean, if you're a suspicious person, you say, oh, she's caught in a lie. She says he comes at 4, and then, but if it happened at 6, then he should have been at home when he should have seen. So now she's changing her story, so he doesn't come home till 9. Of course, the likelihood she's this devious is small. Rather, what's going on is she's really has no clue about these numbers, and so she's just going to lead, the interviewer's just going to lead her into further inconsistencies the more questions about time she asks.
Are you awake when he comes home?
No,
No.
I'm asleep.
Okay.
Now that last question is interesting. Are you awake when your dad comes home? Now, of course, that requires a little bit of inference. But notice that she does give a sensible answer. Notice that it is a when question, but it's a certain kind of when question, which doesn't require the child to talk about time. They don't have to talk about here, let me get back to you. They don't have to talk about the calendar information. Notice they're talking about what was happening when something else happened, and that's a different kind of question that children oftentimes are capable of answering. Okay, so let me now move to some temporal recommendations, and I'm going to incorporate and I'm going to give you some number recommendations as well. So the first one is you do want to ask time questions when they're open-ended questions about what happened next. It also is the case that you can ask the child, what's the first thing that happened? And children are quite good at being able to move to the beginning of an event, at least their perceptions of the event, and tell you what's the first thing. And the one thing you want to be careful of, and I haven't described this before, but you probably have seen this in some of your trainings, you do want to be careful with the what happened before questions, because it turns out that the younger children, and I would say, younger would be children up to maybe around 5, may have difficulty with a before question. So if you say, what happened before blah, blah, they won't tell you what happened before blah, blah. They'll tell you what happened after, and that can create lots of confusion. So as much as possible, you do want to ask the child questions about sequence and ask them about forward sequence. Another recommendation is to ask when questions, including what was happening when abuse occurred, or in this case, where was she when her father comes home, or what was her mom doing when the abuse occurred. Now, you have to be careful with these simultaneity questions, and those, what was happening when something else happened. Because although we haven't tested this systematically, I worry that children sometimes will guess about this information. So if she was asked, where was your mother when he was abusing you, there's a good chance the child really has no clue, and the child is going to give you what she thinks, or where she thinks her mother was, because obviously her mother wasn't there for her to see her actually in a particular place. So you want to be careful with those simultaneity questions. But the bottom line is the when word itself does not force a child into giving you conventional temporal information, right? If I say to you, for example, if I say to a child, when do you get up in the morning? The child doesn't have to know anything about time in a clock sense in order to give me a sensible answer to that question. And this is something actually researchers have shown. So children will often tell you what was happening before. So when do you get up after I sleep at night? Or they'll tell you what caused the event to happen. So you say, when do you get up? They'll say, when my mother wakes me up. right? Or they'll tell you what was happening at the time. So when do you get up? When my brother gets up, right? And those are all useful pieces of information. We're not getting calendar information. We're not getting age information, but we're getting useful information. And for that reason, I do recommend that you ask when questions. And of course, with an older child, they may well, in fact, have that kind of conventional temporal information that you may need. A third recommendation is you may be able to get at timing through where questions, right, which often allow you to date abuse. An example of this would be children in most families move quite frequently. People are highly mobile. And so there's a good chance that the child will be able to tell you about abuse that occurred in different places, and based on other people's knowledge, adults' knowledge in the case, where will connect to when. And the child doesn't have to give you that when information, that temporal information, but can give you the where information. And of course, the way to think about it is the child will remember where they were during abuse, because that's something that they can see. When they go back and they think of this memory, they can see where they are. They don't, see a calendar on the wall or see a date stamp on this memory, but they do see where, and that where can be connected to other information to when. One really kind of a clever use of this where question is you ask the child where their brother was or where their sister was when these things happened. And children will often be able to tell you that their brother was just a baby or hadn't been born. And of course, if the child was just a baby, you now can take the brother's current age and think about how old babies can be, right? Babies are going to be up to probably up to 2, and you can now date the event in a very clever way. And the final time recommendation is you want to avoid how old were you, what year was it, what month. And here, I know you're going to run into trouble if you're an interviewer who is, works with with some people, and it can be law enforcement, it can be social workers, it can be prosecutors, although I think law enforcement tend to be the ones who are most focused on trying to get this temporal information. And you'll feel compelled to ask these questions because you'll be told this is absolutely legally necessary. Now, of course, I want you to be skeptical and ask lots of questions, and every chance you get, talk to prosecutors and say, is it really necessary that I have this precise information? Because here are the reasons why, if I go ahead and ask it, kids are going to guess, I'm going to get crazy answers, they're going to be inconsistent. It's good to work out these issues with your with whoever it is that is giving you advice, legal advice on how questions should be asked. But I would say this: if you absolutely must ask, right? If you're forced to ask, then phrase it as an estimate, recognizing that children cannot give you an exact answer. So instead of saying how old were you when, say how old do you think you might have been when? And the child will give you the same answer. But what you're doing is you're qualifying the answer, which reduces the likelihood that the child is going to be boxed in some way, that a different answer at a different time will make the child look absolutely incredible. And that would just be unfair. Okay, what about number recommendations? Excuse me. So number recommendations, very simple. First of all, just don't ask how many times. Don't do it, right? Kids will give you an answer. It's easy to guess. They're likely to be wrong. Even the standard question that is taught, and you've probably learned this question, even the, did it happen one time or more than one time, is risky. We were really surprised at how poor children were at answering how many times they had, whether they had one placement or more than one placement, or whether they had been to court once or more than once. As you recall, a good third of them were getting these placement questions wrong. Now, I should be careful here. There hasn't been a lot of research on numerosity judgments, and there are reasons why we may have misestimated children's abilities, but it clearly gives you reason to worry. And so how do you avoid asking these kinds of questions? Well, one way you can do so is you can say to yourself, the point is not to get the child to say, oh, I've been abused 65 times, and then the prosecutor is going to charge 65 counts. That actually is really quite absurd, that sort of scenario is likely. What's more likely is that the prosecutor will talk about the need for individual events, and then we'll be able to count those events in order to come up with some notion of frequency or numerosity. Okay? Well, that means that you should be asking these questions to get at individual episodes. And how do you do that? Well, here again, we can rely on the protocols, including the NICHD protocol. You'll ask questions like, tell me everything that happened the time you remember the most. Tell me everything that happened the first time. Tell me everything that happened the last time, because children will often remember the initiation of abuse. That was significant. He'd never done anything like that before. Children will often remember the last time because it's the most recent, it's the freshest in their mind, and oftentimes it's a turning point. Oftentimes, like, something serious happened, and that then led to the child's disclosure. Notice that you're not saying, tell me about the time you remember the most. You're not saying, tell me about the first time. You want to watch out for questions that children think are asking for conventional temporal information and really are not. And that's the reason why you say, tell me everything that happened the first time, not tell me about the first time. If you say, tell me about the first time, the child's going to think you're trying to get them to give you an age or a date. And a lot of kids will say, I don't remember. And you'll think, how can you not remember the first time? And what they're saying is, I don't remember what time it was, even though they may remember the event. Here's other nice ones you can ask. Nice tell me everything questions. Tell me about something different. Tell me about the worst thing. And we've been doing some experimental work with this, and we haven't done any field work yet, but these are potentially really good questions. Not only do they get at adding numerosity, right? Because you add an event to the storehouse of events that the child has narrated, but you also get really important, interesting forensic information. Okay? Okay, now I'm going to conclude with just a few thoughts about where to get more information. So, as you saw, I talked about a study, and if you're interested in getting a copy of the study, you can do so. You can get a free reprint of it. If you Google Bepress Lion, B-E-P-R-E-S-S Lion, you can get reprints of that paper. You also may find useful, of course, the 10-step interview, which is the protocol that I stole, that I developed, and which is widely taught. And it has, there's a section of it that deals with this issue of getting at multiple individual events. If you're interested in online interview training, and this is my time and number lecture is actually almost twice as long as this one, so I talk more at length about these issues, but of course about all the other issues involved with interviewing. You can Google MRCAC Lion, and MRCAC stands for the Midwestern Regional Child Advocacy Center. And finally, if you want to reach me, definitely do so. I put my email in the PowerPoint slides, and I'd love to hear from you, because the everything we do is designed to try to make practice easier. But we got to know, what are the problems that are coming up for you in your practice. That's what gives us some insight into what kind of problems to work on for the future. So hope you found this useful, and now I'll be able to take some questions.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so I see in the chat box a bunch of questions, and I guess we have looks to me like we have about 7 minutes, and so I'm going to work through them. So Tina Winger asks, you suggested that once or more than once is not a great question. Can you give some examples on how to get information about multiple incidents? And yeah, now that last part, I think, Tina, you asked that before I mentioned the tell me about everything that happened, the time you remember the most. the first time, last time, different time. And so I think that answers that second part of your question. Let me say a little bit more about the problems of the once or more than once question and how you can avoid asking it altogether. The problem is not only that it's hard for children to enumerate, even if it's just 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4. It's also because the whole idea of something happening a certain number of times is an abstract concept. And so imagine, for example, that the child is raped. And I'm thinking of a particular case. I usually show this video if I have more time, where the child is raped on a particular occasion. But when asked how many times was he raped, he says, oh, about 10 times. And it seems incredible. It's like, well, you weren't raped 10 times. You only raped 1 time. But then you have to stop and say, well, wait a minute. What do you mean by the word rape? What constitutes rape? And what is the boy thinking when he's thinking about enumerating rape? Well, he's probably thinking about, something about like the number of times that he was penetrated. And so he may say, that abuse happened on multiple occasions because he's thinking about multiple hits or multiple insertions or multiple acts. And so that once or more than once question is just very risky. Now, someone points out, and I'm going to jump ahead to Tina's next question before I get to Lindsay Jones's question. Tina says, well, if you don't know for sure that there was more than 1 time, isn't it suggestive to ask, tell me about the first, last, worst? And that's an excellent point. So how do you avoid asking it? Well, listen to that first narrative of abuse that the child gives you. When they first say something like, my dad touches me, and you say, tell me everything that happened, and the child talks about it before you get to any idea of first or last or whether it happened once or more than once. If you're listening to the child and the child is using words like usually or sometimes or he would always, then they're clearly talking about more than once. And it is not suggestive to say, well, tell me everything that happened the time you remember the most. Tell me everything that happened the first time. Tell me everything that happened the last time. Because they're using words like usually or sometimes, which clearly mean that it was happened more than once, right? Now, maybe they don't do that. Maybe they just describe an individual event when you first question them, or maybe it's unclear, or maybe they're a very young child, and you probably know this. Very young children will always use what sounds like script language. They'll always say, he X's me, and that sounds like they're saying he does it on a number of occasions, but it's just the way that very young kids talk. Well, those kids, you do have to ask the once or more than once, but you need to take the answer with a grain of salt. And so you may well get an answer from the child that makes it clear that it only happened on 1 occasion. And you'll just know that the child's answer more than once is probably due to maybe the confusion I just talked about. And through your follow-up questions, tell me everything that happened, what happened next, and your attempts to get it first and last, you'll then start to understand. So the idea is that once or more than once is a question that you can ask if you're unsure about numerosity. I just want you to be careful with it, and you can avoid it in cases where the child clearly talks about more than one event in their first narrative. Okay, Lindsay Jones says, what do you suggest for following up with the teenagers that insist that the abuse happened on a specific date? Something that would help them with their credibility. Or that just assesses their credibility, because of course, there's always a chance that they're not telling the truth. In any case where a child says it happened on this particular date, I would just say, what makes you think it happened on that date, or how do you know it happened on that date? And ask the child for their reasoning about it. And if they give you a good reason, then you have reason to believe them. If they can't explain the reasoning at all, then you can start to wonder, and you can press a little bit. Say, well, why do you think it happened on that date? And it may well be, of course, that the child is telling the truth about the abuse, but has come to the conclusion that a certain date is accurate, and that date information may be the result of some kind of suggestive influence. A really scary thing that I've seen is that sometimes This tends to be patrol officers who think that they need to get this kind of information at the very beginning. Sometimes patrol officers will question children in quite a leading way to get them to say that it happened in a particular date or they were a particular age. And it may be necessary for you to extract that information to show that, okay, now that's stuff that was suggested to the child, but the child has this other narrative, this narrative information that seems quite convincing. Okay. Sarah says, we can hear you, Tom. Well, I'm really happy to hear that. Otherwise, you'd be reading my lips now. Jen Davidson asks, if your MDT supports avoiding these types of time, date, numeric questions, what recommendations do you have for how we as forensic interviewers defend the decision not to pursue those types of questions in court? Yeah. So how do you defend not asking the question in court? You cite the literature. You cite your training. You say because these are extremely hard questions, and I think that a jury is probably as teachable as well as you folks are, right? And so in the same way that I've been trying to convince you, I think you can convince a jury. So you could say, for example, if I ask an adult, how old were you when you last went camping? It requires the adult to do all sorts of inferential work, and it requires them to have all kinds of conventional knowledge about the calendar, about years, about dates, about when things happen. And you say, so that, it would be like asking the child a question in another language. It's something that the child hasn't learned, and it's simply unfair to expect the child to be able to answer those questions. Okay, you know what? I think it's time. So if there are any other concluding thoughts, Sarah, thank you for hosting this webinar, and I hope you guys have found